Sometimes, the most beautiful connections happen between two souls that the world has forgotten. At a pet adoption auction, an old golden retriever named Buddy waits in his crate while families choose younger dogs. His graying coat and slow movements tell the story of a lifetime spent loving and losing. People walk past without a second glance. Then a little girl appears. She's 8 years old with tangled hair and sad eyes. While others play with the puppies, she kneels by Buddy's crate and puts her hand against the wire. Buddy moves closer. Something special happens between them that only lonely hearts understand. What made this little girl choose the oldest, most overlooked dog at the auction? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The little girl's name was Emma, though she rarely spoke it aloud these days. At 8 years old, she had learned that silence often felt safer than words. Her small fingers traced the worn fabric of her teddy bear as she sat in the passenger seat of her grandmother's old sedan, watching the countryside roll past the window. The bear, once golden brown, had faded to the color of weak tea after years of faithful companionship. "Are you excited about the pet fair, sweetheart?" her grandmother asked, glancing over with eyes that held both love and worry. Dorothy Chun had raised 3 children of her own, but taking on an 8-year-old at 72 felt like learning to swim all over again. Emma nodded but didn't speak. She had been living with Grandma Dot for almost 2 years now, ever since the accident that took her parents on a rainy Tuesday evening. The social workers had explained it all very carefully, using gentle voices and careful words. But Emma understood the simple truth. She was alone now, except for this kind woman who smelled like lavender soap and made pancakes every Sunday morning. Their small house on Maple Street sat at the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the streetlights grew sparse. It wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen where the linoleum curled at the edges. But Grandma Dot had made it feel like home. She had hung Emma's drawings on the refrigerator, set up a reading corner by the window, and never once complained about the nightmares that sometimes sent Emma padding down the hallway in the middle of the night. Money was always tight. Emma had learned to recognize the worried crease between her grandmother's eyebrows when the bills came in the mail. She knew that doctor visits cost money they didn't have, and that the monthly check from Social Security barely covered the rent and groceries. Sometimes Emma heard her grandmother on the phone late at night, speaking in hushed tones about making ends meet and just until I get back on my feet. But today was different. Today was special. Grandma Dot had announced over breakfast that they were going to the annual pet adoption fair, something Emma had seen advertised on colorful flyers around town, but never imagined she might actually attend. Every child should have a pet, her grandmother had said, though Emma caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested this decision hadn't come easily. Something to love and take care of. Something that's just yours. Emma understood what she really meant. Something to love you back unconditionally. Something that won't leave you behind. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity as they pulled into the dusty parking lot. Families wandered between booths. Children squealed with delight at the sight of puppies tumbling over each other, and volunteers in matching T-shirts directed the chaos with practiced efficiency. The air filled with a symphony of barks, meows, and excited chatter. Emma hung back as they approached the main area, her teddy bear clutched tight against her chest. She had always been shy, but losing her parents had deepened her natural reserve into something more protective. At school, she sat alone at lunch, completed her assignments without comment, and avoided the playground where children formed easy friendships that seemed as foreign to her as speaking a different language. "Take your time, honey," Grandma Dot sighed, settling onto a nearby bench with a slight wince. Her arthritis had been acting up lately, especially in the morning when the weather turned damp. "We're not in any hurry." Emma wandered through the rows of cages and enclosures, past bouncing puppies with bright eyes and endless energy, past kittens that pounced on anything that moved, past rabbits and guinea pigs, and even a pair of ferrets that chased each other in playful circles. Families gathered around the younger animals, children pressing their faces against wire mesh while parents asked practical questions about vaccinations and house training. She found herself drawn to the quieter corners where the older animals waited with patient dignity. A gray cat with white whiskers slept curled in a perfect circle. An elderly beagle lifted his head hopefully whenever someone approached, then settled back down when they moved on. These animals seemed to understand something about disappointment that the puppies hadn't learned yet. That's when she saw him dot in a crate slightly apart from the others. Sat a golden retriever with a coat that had dulled from bright gold to something closer to amber. His muzzle showed gray, and when he moved, it was with the careful deliberation of age. He wasn't performing for attention like the younger dogs, no jumping or excited barking. Instead, he sat with quiet dignity, watching the crowd with eyes that seemed to hold stories. A small placard on his crate read, "Buddy, 8 years old. Good with children, house-trained. Needs quiet home." 8 years old. The same age as Emma. Something in his stillness called to her. While other children gravitated toward the puppies with their boundless energy and adorable antics, Emma found herself kneeling by Buddy's crate. He looked at her with calm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to her heart. She had learned to be careful with her affection, to guard her heart against another loss. But something about this old dog's patient acceptance touched a place in her soul that had been carefully protected since the night her world changed forever. "He's been here for 3 months, a volunteer said, approaching with a gentle smile. "But he's a sweet old boy, but most families want puppies. He's getting up there in years, and people worry about vet bills and—" She stopped herself, perhaps realizing that discussing an animal's limitations wasn't the best sales pitch. Emma barely heard her. She was lost in those warm brown eyes that seemed to understand something about being overlooked, about being different, about carrying invisible wounds that others couldn't see. "Can I pet him?" she whispered. The first words she had spoken since leaving the house that morning. The volunteer's face brightened. "Of course, sweetheart. Let me open the crate." As the latch clicked open, Buddy didn't rush forward like the younger dogs might have. Instead, he moved slowly to the front of the crate and extended his graying muzzle toward Emma's outstretched hand. His nose was warm and slightly damp against her palm. In that moment, something shifted in Emma's carefully guarded heart. This old dog, passed over by family after family, seemed to recognize something in her that she had barely recognized in herself. The need to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved exactly as you are. Grandma Bot appeared beside her, breathing slightly hard from the walk. She took one look at Emma's face, more animated than it had been in months, and knew that their quiet life was about to change in ways both wonderful and challenging. "What's his name?" Emma asked, never taking her eyes off the dog. "Buddy," the volunteer replied. "He's been a very good boy, very patient. He just needs someone to give him a chance." Emma understood about needing chances. She understood about being patient. And looking into Buddy's gentle eyes, she realized that maybe they had been waiting for each other all along. The decision came to Emma with surprising certainty, like watching a puzzle piece settle into its perfect place. While families around them deliberated over younger, more energetic dogs, she simply knew that Buddy belonged with them. The old leather collar around his neck bore the scratches and wear of a life fully lived, and something about its weathered appearance spoke to her in a way that bright new collars on the puppies never could. "Grandma," she said softly, tugging on Dorothy's sleeve, "I want this one." Dorothy looked down at her granddaughter, then at the aging golden retriever who was now gently licking Emma's fingers through the crate opening. She had expected this moment to involve squealing over a puppy, debates about which fluffy ball of energy to choose. This quiet certainty caught her off guard. "Honey, are you sure? There are so many young dogs here who might be more." "I'm sure." Emma interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "He needs us." The volunteer, whose name tag read Sarah, smiled warmly at the exchange. "Buddy is a wonderful choice. He's been waiting so patiently for the right family. Let me tell you a bit about him." She opened a folder thick with paperwork and photographs. "He came to us from an elderly gentleman who could no longer care for him. Before that, he lived with a family who moved overseas and couldn't take him along. He's had his shots, he's house-trained, and he's wonderful with children. The vet says he's in good health for his age, though he does have some minor arthritis in his hips." Dorothy's practical mind immediately went to the costs, food, vet bills, unexpected emergencies. Their budget was already stretched thin, and adding a pet, especially an older one who might require medical care, seemed almost reckless. But looking at Emma's face, seeing a spark of life that had been missing for so long, she found herself nodding. "What's involved in the adoption process?" she asked Dot. As Sarah explained the paperwork and fees, other families continued to flow around them. A young couple with toddler twins gravitated toward a pair of golden retriever puppies, their children shrieking with delight as the young dogs tumbled over each other in playful chaos. An elderly man spent long minutes considering a senior cat, who purred contentedly in his arms. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds. Emma remained focused entirely on Buddy, who had positioned himself at the front of his crate to be as close to her as possible. She noticed details that others might have overlooked: the gentle intelligence in his eyes, the way he seemed to understand the rhythm of her breathing, the patience with which he waited for her attention. Why didn't anyone else want him? "Emma," asked quietly. Sarah hesitated and decided on honesty. "Most people come looking for puppies. They want dogs who will grow up with their families, who will be around for many years. But he's got maybe 5 or 6 good years left, and some folks see that as limiting. But he's got so much love to give right now, today." Emma understood this logic in a way that surprised the adults around her. She had learned that time wasn't guaranteed, that love didn't come with warranties or promises of forever. What mattered was the love you could share right now, in this moment. The adoption fee was modest $50 to help cover veterinary care and food during his stay at the shelter. Dorothy counted out the bills with slightly shaking hands. Money that had been set aside for Emma's school clothes, but somehow felt better spent on this quiet miracle happening before her eyes. The paperwork seemed endless: health records, vaccination history, emergency contact information, agreements about veterinary care and return policies. Emma signed her name in careful third-grade cursive where indicated, making this decision officially hers. Other families around them completed similar rituals with more fanfare. Children posed for photos with their new puppies, while parents captured videos of first meetings and excited reactions. Emma's choice threw curious glances an 8-year-old. Girl choosing an 8-year-old dog seemed unusual enough to warrant attention. "That's different," she heard one mother whisper to another. "I thought kids always wanted puppies." "Maybe she knows something we don't," came the reply. When the paperwork was complete, Sarah handed Emma a new leash blue nylon with a sturdy clasp and opened Buddy's crate fully for the first time. He emerged slowly, stretching muscles that had been cramped in the small space, and looked around with calm assessment rather than excitement. "He's very gentle," Sarah assured them. "He's never shown any aggression, and he's been good with all the children who visited. Just remember that he might be a little confused for the first few days. New homes can be overwhelming for any pet." Emma clipped the leash to Buddy's warm collar with hands that trembled slightly with anticipation. He stood patiently while she figured out the mechanism, his tail offering a subtle wag when she succeeded. The walk to their car felt ceremonial. Buddy moved at a measured pace beside Emma, neither pulling ahead nor lagging behind. He seemed to understand that this was a significant moment, worthy of dignity and attention. Other families were loading excited puppies into carriers and back seats, but Buddy approached their sedan and waited politely for direction. Dorothy opened the back door, unsure how the older dog would handle getting into the car. To her surprise, Buddy hopped up with only the slightest hesitation, settling himself on the worn fabric seats as if he had been riding in this particular car for years. Emma climbed in beside him, her teddy bear momentarily forgotten in favor of running her fingers through Buddy's thick coat. It was softer than she had expected, though she could feel the slight stiffness in his movements that Sarah had mentioned. The drive home was quiet, filled with anticipation rather than conversation. Buddy pressed his nose to the window occasionally, watching the familiar landscape roll past, but mostly he seemed content to sit close to Emma, accepting gentle pets and whispered reassurances. "What do you think he'll like best about our house?" Emma asked as they turned onto Maple Street. "I think he'll like having someone to love," Dorothy replied, glancing in the rearview mirror at the unlikely pair sharing the back seat. When they pulled into their small driveway, Buddy waited patiently for the door to open before stepping out onto the cracked pavement. He stood for a moment, nose lifted to catch the sense of this new place. The neighbor's barbecue, the roses blooming along the fence line, the particular smell of home that every house carries. Emma led him up the front steps, past the pots of geraniums that Dorothy tended with careful attention, and through the front door into the modest living room that was about to become his sanctuary. Buddy paused at the threshold, and for a moment, Emma worried that he might be having second thoughts. But then he stepped inside, his tail beginning to wag with something approaching enthusiasm as he took in the cozy space that smelled like lavender soap and Sunday pancakes. This was how their new life together began, not with fanfare or excitement, but with the quiet satisfaction of two souls recognizing they had found exactly what they needed in each other. The first week with Buddy unfolded like a gentle dance between three souls, learning each other's rhythms. Emma discovered that having someone depend on her for food and water and companionship gave her days a structure she hadn't realized she needed. She woke each morning to find Buddy waiting patiently by her bed, his tail beginning its slow wag. The moment her eyes opened, "Good morning, boy," she would whisper, and his tail would wag faster, though he never jumped or demanded attention the way younger dogs might. Instead, he would rest his gray muzzle on the edge of her bed and wait for her to invite him closer. Dorothy watched this morning ritual from the doorway, marveling at the transformation in her granddaughter. The child who had spent 2 years moving through their house like a ghost was suddenly animated by purpose. Emma measured Buddy's food with scientific precision, filled his water bowl without being reminded, and spent long minutes brushing his thick coat while he stood with patient dignity. "He needs a walk after breakfast," Emma announced on their third day together, consulting a library book about dog care that she had read cover to cover twice. The book says older dogs need regular exercise, but not too much at once. The morning walks became their special time. Emma would clip on Buddy's leash, and they would make their way slowly around the neighborhood, Buddy stopping to investigate interesting smells, while Emma practiced reading aloud from whatever book she had tucked into her jacket pocket. She discovered that Buddy was an excellent listener, never interrupting or showing impatience when she stumbled over difficult words. Their neighbors began to take notice. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down and tended to keep track of everyone's business, made a point of being in her front yard whenever they passed. "That's quite a dog you've got there," she called out one morning, her tone suggesting this wasn't entirely a compliment. "He's getting up there in years, isn't he?" Emma bristled at the implied criticism. "He's 8, she said firmly. "That's not old. That's just right." Buddy seemed oblivious to such judgments. He greeted each person they encountered with the same gentle dignity, tail wagging moderately, accepting pets if offered, but never demanding attention. Children from Emma's school sometimes spotted them during their walks, and Emma found herself explaining her choice with growing confidence. "Why didn't you get a puppy?" asked Madison Wells, a classmate who lived on the corner house with the perfectly manicured lawn. "Because Buddy needed me," Emma replied simply. Puppies can find homes anywhere. Buddy was waiting for someone special. At home, Buddy adapted to their routines with remarkable ease. He claimed the sunny spot by the living room window as his own, where he could keep watch over the front yard while Emma did her homework at the kitchen table. When Dorothy's arthritis flared up on damp mornings, he seemed to sense her discomfort and would position himself within reach so she could rest her hand on his warm back. The house felt different with Buddy in it, fuller somehow, as if his presence had filled spaces they hadn't realized were empty. Dorothy found herself talking to him while she cooked dinner, and he would listen with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in her opinions about whether the chicken needed more seasoning. Emma's transformation was the most remarkable change. The school photo tucked into the corner of Dorothy's dresser mirror showed a little girl standing apart from her classmates, shoulders hunched defensively, eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. But now Emma stood straighter, spoke more often, and even smiled occasionally without prompting. "Tell me about your dog," her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, said one afternoon when Emma lingered after class to organize her backpack with unusual care. "His name is Buddy," Emma said, and then, as if a dam had burst, she began to talk. She told Mrs. Rodriguez about Buddy's gentle manners, about how he waited patiently for his meals, about the way he seemed to understand when she felt sad without her needing to explain anything. "He sounds very special," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Would you like to write about him for our next assignment?" That evening, Emma spent an hour composing a story about Buddy's first week with them, describing in careful detail how he had inspected every corner of their house before choosing his favorite sleeping spot, how he had learned to recognize the sound of Dorothy's medication timer, and would gently nudge her when she forgot to take her pills. The challenges were small but real. Buddy's food cost more than Emma had anticipated, and Dorothy worried quietly about upcoming veterinary expenses. His occasional nighttime restlessness, probably from arthritis in his hips, sometimes woke them, and Emma would pad out to the living room to sit with him until he settled. But these minor difficulties paled beside the daily gifts of his presence. Emma found herself looking forward to coming home from school, knowing that Buddy would be waiting by the front window, his tail beginning to wag the moment he spotted her walking up the street. Dorothy discovered that having someone to care for eased the loneliness that had settled over their house like dust since Emma's parents died. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the adoption, Emma sat in their small backyard with Buddy stretched out beside her in the warm September sun. She was reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, a book that had taken on new meaning now that she understood something about unlikely friendships and choosing to love someone others might overlook. "Some pig," she read, and Buddy's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. Though his eyes remained closed in contentment, Emma paused in her reading to study his face, the gray whiskers around his muzzle, the small scar above his left eyebrow that suggested stories from his past she would never know, the way his chest rose and fell with the deep, even breathing of complete trust. For the first time since her parents' death, Emma felt something approaching happiness settle in her chest. Not the wild, careless joy of early childhood, but something deeper and more durable. The satisfaction of being needed, of making a difference in another creature's life, of discovering that love didn't have to come with guarantees to be real and transforming. "We're going to be good together," she whispered to Buddy, and his tail thumped once against the grass in what she chose to interpret as agreement. Dorothy watched them from the kitchen window as she prepared dinner, noting how Emma's shoulders had lost their defensive hunch, how naturally she moved around their four-legged family member. The decision to adopt Buddy had stretched their resources and added complications to their quiet life. But watching Emma bloom under the responsibility of caring for another living being, Dorothy knew it was perhaps the best choice she had made. Since taking custody of her granddaughter, some transformations happened overnight, dramatic and obvious. But the best ones, Dorothy reflected, unfolded slowly and surely, like watching a flower open one petal at a time until suddenly you realize something beautiful had been happening all along. The reality of pet ownership revealed itself in degrees, like layers of an onion peeling away to show what lay beneath the surface excitement. 2 weeks after bringing Buddy home, Dorothy made the appointment she had been dreading. Their first visit to the veterinarian. Dr. Martinez's office smelled like disinfectant and anxiety, though Buddy seemed remarkably calm as they waited in the small examination room. Emma sat beside him on the metal bench, one hand resting on his back while he panted quietly in the warm space. "Let's take a look at this handsome fellow," Dr. Martinez said as he entered, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who spent his days helping worried pet owners. Buddy submitted to the examination with patient dignity, standing still while the veterinarian checked his ears, felt along his joints, and listened to his heart. Emma watched every detail of the examination, asking questions about normal heart, RTES, and proper nutrition. But her attention sharpened when she noticed Dr. Martinez spending extra time examining Buddy's hips and back legs. "He's in good shape overall," the veterinarian said finally, making notes on his chart. "But he does have moderate arthritis in both hips, which is common for dogs his age and breed. Golden retrievers are prone to joint issues as they get older." The words hit Dorothy like small stones. She had known this was possible, but hearing it confirmed made the future feel suddenly more complicated. "What does that mean for him?" Emma asked, her voice smaller than it had been in recent weeks. "It means we need to keep him comfortable," Dr. Martinez explained gently. "There are medications that can help with inflammation and pain, special food designed for joint health. And we'll want to monitor him regularly to make sure he's managing well." He handed Dorothy a prescription and a list of recommended foods, along with an estimate for ongoing care that made her stomach clench. The numbers on the paper represented nearly a month of groceries, or the portion of their heating bill that always made her choose between staying warm and staying fed. The drive home was quiet, Buddy sleeping in the back seat while Emma stared out the window at familiar houses that suddenly seemed to belong to families with more resources, more options, more room for expensive medical emergencies. "Grandma?" Emma said as they pulled into their driveway. "Are we going to have to give Buddy back?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Dorothy turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking at her granddaughter's face in the rearview mirror, the careful blankness that had returned, the protective shell sliding back into place around her heart. "No, sweetheart," Dorothy said firmly, though she had no idea how they would manage. "We're not giving him back. We'll figure this out." That evening, while Emma helped Buddy settle into his favorite spot by the window, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. The medication would cost $60 a month. The special food was twice the price of regular dog food. Regular checkups every few months would add up quickly. She could cancel her own doctor's appointments for a while, she reasoned. Skip the physical therapy sessions that helped her arthritis. Eat more rice and beans, fewer fresh vegetables. There were ways to make it work, even if they weren't sustainable in the long term. The first sign of neighborhood disapproval came from an unexpected source. Mr. Henderson, who lived directly next door and had always been cordial, appeared at their front door on a Thursday evening with a carefully controlled expression. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. "But your dog has been barking during the day while you're at work and school. It's been disturbing my wife's rest. She works nights at the hospital." Dorothy felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Buddy is usually very quiet." "Well, he's not quiet when you're gone," Mr. Henderson continued. "Look, I understand you're trying to do a good thing here, but maybe an older dog isn't the right fit for your situation. There are other options, you know?" After he left, Emma sat on the floor next to Buddy, her arms around his neck while silent tears dripped onto his golden fur. "He doesn't understand," she whispered. "You're not a bad dog. You're just lonely." The barking during the day became a source of constant worry. Dorothy tried leaving the radio on for company, placing Buddy's bed in different rooms, even asking their elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson to check on him during her afternoon walks. Nothing seemed to help, and Emma began to dread coming home from school, afraid of finding another complaint note or worse. Animal control officers at their door doubted school. The teasing began subtly, the way it always did among children who sensed vulnerability. It started with Madison Wells and a group of friends, who had initially shown polite interest in Emma's unusual pet choice. "My mom says old dogs are more trouble than they're worth," Madison announced during lunch one day, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Emma's table in the corner. "She says people who get old dogs are just asking for problems." Emma felt her cheeks burn, but kept eating her sandwich, focusing intently on the pages of her book. She had learned that engaging with Madison's comments usually made things worse. "I heard your dog is already sick," another girl chimed in. "My dad says joint problems in dogs are really expensive. Maybe your family should have thought about that before adopting." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Emma closed her book and got up from the table, dumping her half-eaten lunch in the trash as she headed for the library, the one place in school where children were required to be quiet. But even there, surrounded by the familiar comfort of books, Emma couldn't shake the growing worry that maybe everyone was right. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe wanting something badly enough wasn't the same as being able to handle it properly. That afternoon, she found Buddy waiting by the front window as always, his tail beginning its gentle wag the moment he spotted her on the sidewalk. Mrs. Henderson was in her front yard, pointedly avoiding eye contact while she tended to her roses with sharp, aggressive movements. "Did you have a bad day while I was gone?" Emma asked Buddy as she let herself into the house. He followed her to the kitchen, where she poured him fresh water and measured out his special food with careful attention to the recommended portions as if sensing her sadness. Buddy abandoned his dinner after a few bites and came to sit beside her chair. He rested his graying muzzle on her knee and looked up at her with eyes that seemed to understand more than a dog should be able to understand. "I won't let them make us give you up," Emma whispered, running her fingers through his soft ears. "I don't care what they say. You belong with us." That evening, Dorothy found Emma in the backyard, sitting in the gathering dusk with Buddy stretched out beside her. Her granddaughter's school assignment lay forgotten on the picnic table while she stared up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Rough day?" Dorothy asked, settling onto the bench beside them with a slight wince as her joints protested the movement. Emma nodded but didn't speak. Sometimes words felt inadequate for the weight of what she was feeling, the fierce protectiveness toward Buddy, mixed with the growing awareness that love alone might not be enough to overcome the practical challenges they faced. "You know," Dorothy said quietly, "when I was young, people used to say I was foolish for marrying your grandfather. He didn't have much money, and his family thought I could do better. They said love doesn't pay the bills." Emma turned to look at her grandmother, waiting for the rest of the story. "They weren't wrong about the practical parts," Dorothy continued. "Love doesn't pay bills, but it does something more important. It gives you reasons to find ways to pay them. It makes you stronger and more creative and more determined than you ever thought you could be. As if understanding that he was the subject of their conversation, Buddy rolled onto his back, his legs splayed in the air in a position that looked both undignified and completely trusting. Despite everything, the worry about money, the complaints from neighbors, the cruel comments at school, Emma found herself smiling. "We'll figure out the barking," Dorothy said, "and the medication costs, and whatever else comes up. Because that's what families do for each other." Emma reached over and scratched Buddy's exposed belly, watching his back leg kick in response. "Even when other people think we're making a mistake. Especially then," Dorothy replied. "The best decisions usually look like mistakes to people who don't understand what really matters." As they sat together in the cooling evening air, Emma felt something settle in her chest. Not the absence of worry, but the presence of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them. Because some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth defending against a world that didn't always understand the value of choosing love over convenience. October arrived, with the kind of gray drizzle that seemed to seep into everything: clothes, houses, spirits. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notice that had arrived in yesterday's mail, the words blurring together as her reading glasses fogged with unshed tears. Notice to quit. Violation of lease agreement. Unauthorized pet on premises. The letter was typed on official letterhead, cold and impersonal, giving them 30 days to remove the pet or face eviction proceedings. Emma's school bus rumbled past the window, and Dorothy quickly folded the notice and slipped it into the pile of other bills. She couldn't bring herself to open yet. The timing couldn't have been worse. Dorothy's own medical bills had been mounting since her fall last month. Nothing serious, just a stumble on the front, steps that had resulted in x-rays and follow-up appointments that added up faster than she could manage. Her monthly Social Security check barely covered their basic expenses, and Buddy's medication had already forced some difficult choices about groceries and heating bills. When Emma bounded through the front door that afternoon, Buddy's tail wagging, his usual greeting, Dorothy almost managed to hide her worry behind a smile. But Emma had developed an uncanny ability to read the subtle signs of adult distress. The tightness around her grandmother's eyes, the way she held her shoulders when carrying burdens too heavy to share. "What's wrong?" Emma asked directly, dropping her backpack by the door and approaching with the careful attention of someone who had learned that trouble could arrive without warning. Dorothy had never been good at lying to children. "We've received a notice from our landlord," she said carefully. "About Buddy." Emma's face went very still. "What kind of notice?" "The lease agreement says no pets," Dorothy explained, her voice gentle but tired. "Mr. Garrett says we need to find Buddy a new home or find ourselves a new place to live." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Emma sank into the chair across from her grandmother, her hand automatically reaching for Buddy, who had positioned himself beside her with the intuitive timing of a creature who understood when his presence was most needed. "Can't we just move somewhere else?" Emma asked, though even at 8 years old, she understood that their housing options were limited by more than just pet policies. "Moving costs money we don't have," Dorothy said quietly. "Security deposits, first month's rent, moving expenses. And most landlords in our price range have the same no-pet policies." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working through Buddy's thick coat while he sat patiently beside her chair. "What if we gave up something else instead? I don't need new school clothes. We could eat peanut butter sandwiches every day. I could get a job." "Oh, sweetheart," Dorothy interrupted, her heart breaking at the fierce determination in her granddaughter's voice. "You're 8 years old. Taking care of Buddy isn't worth ruining your childhood over." "Yes, it is," Emma said with startling firmness. "He's family now. You don't give up family just because things get hard." That evening, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table and Buddy dozed at her feet. Dorothy made phone calls with the desperate efficiency of someone running out of options. Rental after rental turned her down the moment she mentioned a pet even. When she explained that Buddy was well-trained, quiet, and therapeutic for her granddaughter, "I'm sorry, but our insurance doesn't allow pets," became a familiar refrain. "Have you considered rehoming the animal?" Each conversation felt like another door closing, another possibility eliminated. Dorothy found herself calculating and recalculating their meager savings, trying to find combinations of numbers that would somehow add up to a solution. Emma's academic performance began to suffer under the weight of constant worry. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the change immediately. The careful attention to detail replaced by distracted staring, the eager participation giving way to withdrawn silence. "Is everything all right at home?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked one afternoon when Emma stayed behind to clean up the art supplies with unusual slowness. Emma hesitated, torn between the adult instruction to keep family problems private and her desperate need to talk to someone who might understand. "We might have to give Buddy away," she said finally, a voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Rodriguez set down the paintbrushes she had been washing and gave Emma her full attention. "That must be very scary for you." "Everyone says we should have known better," Emma continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "They say old dogs are too much trouble, too expensive, too risky. Maybe they're right. What do you think?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think Buddy was worth choosing, even if it turns out hard. I think some things are worth fighting for, even when other people don't understand." At home, the stress was taking its toll on all three members of their small family. Dorothy's arthritis flared with the damp weather and emotional strain, leaving her moving more slowly and sleeping less soundly. Emma threw herself into Buddy's care with desperate intensity, as if perfect attention could somehow shield him from the forces threatening to separate them. Buddy seemed to sense the tension in their house. His usually calm demeanor shifted to something more protective, more alert. He began following Emma more closely, positioning himself between her and any perceived threat, including the neighbor children who had started making comments about the dog that's going to get them kicked out. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Emma returned from school to find Buddy limping more noticeably than usual. His arthritis medication had run out 3 days earlier, and Dorothy had been trying to stretch their budget until her next check arrived. "His hip is bothering him," Emma said, kneeling beside Buddy and running her hands gently along his back legs. "He needs his medicine." "I know, sweetheart," Dorothy replied, her voice tight with the strain of having no good options. "I'll call Dr. Martinez tomorrow and see if we can work out a payment plan." But Emma could see the worry lines deepening around her grandmother's eyes, could feel the weight of accumulated problems pressing down on their small household like a storm front moving in. She had learned to read the signs of adult desperation, and she recognized them now in the way Dorothy's hand shook slightly as she counted bills, in the forced cheerfulness of her voice when she talked about figuring things out. That night, Emma lay in bed, listening to Buddy's careful movements as he tried to find a comfortable position on his bed in the living room. Every small sound, his quiet whimper as he settled, the slight scrape of his nails against the floor as he repositioned himself felt like an accusation against her naive belief that wanting something badly enough could make it work. She had been so certain at the adoption fair, so confident in the rightness of choosing Buddy over the puppies that everyone else preferred. But certainty, she was learning, wasn't the same as wisdom. Love wasn't the same as ability to provide proper care. The community had begun to take notice of their situation, though not always in helpful ways. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, had started making pointed comments about people taking on more than they can handle. While Mr. Henderson's complaints about Buddy's daytime barking had escalated to threats about calling animal control, but there were unexpected sources of support as well. Mrs. Rodriguez had quietly mentioned their situation to a few trusted colleagues, and word was spreading through the small network of teachers and school staff who had watched Emma's transformation over the past months. "That little girl has bloomed since getting that dog," the school secretary confided to the principal. It would be a shame to see the progress reversed. Emma remained unaware of these adult conversations happening around her, focused, instead, on the immediate challenge of keeping Buddy comfortable and healthy with increasingly limited resources. She had started doing small jobs around the neighborhood, raking leaves, carrying groceries, walking other people's dogs, and carefully saving every dollar in a mason jar hidden in her bedroom closet. It wasn't nearly enough, but it felt like doing something, like fighting back against the circumstances that threatened to tear her family apart. On Friday afternoon, as autumn rain drummed against the windows and Buddy slept fitfully by the radiator, Emma sat at the kitchen table working on a school assignment about what I want to be when I grow up. Other children wrote about astronauts and teachers and professional athletes, but Emma found herself writing about becoming a veterinarian, someone who could help animals like Buddy without worrying about whether their families could afford the care they needed. Dorothy watched her granddaughter work, noting the fierce concentration on her young face, the way she chewed her pencil eraser when searching for the right words. Despite everything, the looming eviction, the mounting bills, the neighbor complaints, Emma hadn't given up hope. She was still fighting for their small family, still believing that love could find a way to overcome practical obstacles. And watching that stubborn determination, Dorothy felt something shift in her own heart. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Maybe the lesson here wasn't about learning to accept limitations, but about learning to find creative solutions when conventional approaches failed. The eviction notice still sat in the pile of mail, counting down toward a deadline that felt as inevitable as winter. But for the first time since it arrived, Dorothy allowed herself to consider that giving up might not be their only option. The temporary solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chun, an elderly widow who lived 2 streets over and had known Dorothy since Emma arrived, appeared at their door on a gray Saturday morning with a proposition that felt like a lifeline thrown into churning water. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said without preamble, settling her small frame into Dorothy's kitchen chair with the decisive movement of someone who had made up her mind. "My son moved to California last year, and his old apartment above my garage has been sitting empty. It's not much, but it's clean and dry, and I don't mind pets." The studio apartment was indeed small, 1 room with a kitchenette, a compact bathroom, and windows that looked out over Mrs. Chun's carefully tended vegetable garden. But it was theirs for a rent they could almost afford, and Mrs. Chun's understanding smile when Buddy carefully sniffed every corner made it feel like a sanctuary. "He's a good dog," she observed, watching Buddy pause to look back at Emma before continuing his exploration. "My late husband always said you could tell a lot about people by how their animals behaved. This one knows he's loved." The move itself was accomplished with the help of Emma's teacher and 2 other school staff members who arrived on a crisp October Saturday with a borrowed pickup truck and an afternoon of volunteer labor. Emma directed the placement of their few pieces of furniture with the serious attention of someone who understood that this space needed to become home quickly and completely. Buddy adapted to their new surroundings with the patient flexibility that had characterized his entire stay with them. He found a spot by the window where he could monitor both the main house and the street beyond, claiming it as his own with the quiet confidence of a dog who had learned to make himself at home wherever his people were. But the reduced living space and increased responsibility began to take their toll on Emma in ways that weren't immediately obvious. She had always been mature for her age, But now she found herself managing household tasks that most 8-year-olds never considered. Checking that the door was locked, turning off the small space heater before school, making sure Buddy had enough water for the day. Dorothy's health seemed to worsen with the stress of the move and the approaching winter. Her arthritis made climbing the narrow stairs to their apartment increasingly difficult, and Emma often found herself helping with tasks that her grandmother had always managed independently. "I can carry the groceries," Emma would insist, though the bags were often nearly as large as she was. "You should rest your hands today." The isolation of their new living situation became apparent gradually. While they were grateful for Mrs. Chen's kindness, the garage apartment felt separate from the neighborhood's daily rhythms. Emma's walk to catch the school bus was longer now, and fewer of her classmates lived nearby. It was during one of these longer walks that Emma encountered a situation that would change everything. She was returning from school on a Wednesday afternoon, Buddy walking sedately beside her on his leash, when she heard crying coming from the small park that bordered their new neighborhood. The sound was high and desperate, unmistakably a child in distress. Emma found the source behind a cluster of oak trees. A little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, his face red and streaked with tears, his small body shaking with sobs. "Are you lost?" Emma asked, approaching carefully. She had learned caution around crying children. Sometimes they were hurt, sometimes they were simply overwhelmed, and knowing the difference was important. The boy nodded wordlessly, his crying intensifying at the sight of strangers. Emma looked around for adults who might be searching for him, but the park was empty except for the 3 of them. "What's your name?" she asked gently, crouching down to his eye level while keeping a firm grip on Buddy's leash. "Tyler," the boy managed between hiccuping sobs. "I'm Emma, and this is Buddy," she said. "We're going to help you find your family, okay?" What happened next surprised everyone, including Emma. As she spoke, Buddy moved closer to the crying child, his demeanor shifting into something Emma had never seen before. The dog's entire body language changed. He lowered himself slightly, moved with deliberate slowness, and extended his muzzle toward Tyler with infinite gentleness. Tyler's crying gradually subsided as Buddy positioned himself within arm's reach, not demanding attention, but simply offering his presence. The child's instinctive response was to reach out and touch Buddy's soft ears, and the contact seemed to calm him in a way that Emma's words hadn't quite achieved. "He's nice," Tyler said, his voice still shaky but no longer panicked. "He is nice," Emma agreed, "and he's very good at helping people feel better. Can you tell us where you live?" With Buddy providing silent comfort, Tyler was able to explain that he had wandered away from his grandmother's house while playing in the backyard. He knew his grandmother's name, Mrs. Foster, and the street where she lived, but he wasn't sure how to get back there. Emma made the decision to help him find his way home, though it meant a longer walk than she had planned and the risk of Dorothy worrying when they were late. But something about Tyler's trust in Buddy and Buddy's remarkable response to the child's distress felt too important to ignore. The walk through the neighborhood took nearly an hour, with Tyler holding on to Buddy's leash while Emma asked directions from helpful neighbors. When they finally reached the small blue house on Elm Street, an elderly woman rushed out of the front door with tears of relief streaming down her face. "Tyler? Oh, thank God, I've been calling the police." Mrs. Foster stopped short when she saw Emma and Buddy, her gratitude shifting to curious assessment. "We found him in the park," Emma explained. "He was scared, but Buddy helped him feel better." Mrs. Foster knelt down to embrace her grandson, then looked up at Emma with eyes that seemed to see more than just a helpful neighbor child. "This dog, he's special, isn't he?" The way Tyler responded to him, I've never seen anything like it. Emma felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with her own actions and everything to do with recognizing something remarkable in her 4-legged companion. "He's very good with people who are sad or scared," she said simply. That evening, as Emma recounted the afternoon's adventure to Dorothy. She found herself thinking about Buddy's instinctive response to Tyler's distress. It hadn't been training or commands that guided him. It had been something deeper, an understanding of what was needed in that moment. He knew exactly what to do, Emma marveled, running her hand along Buddy's back as he dozed in his favorite spot by the window. It was like he was born to help people feel better. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter with new understanding. The child who had seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility of pet ownership was beginning to recognize something in Buddy that went beyond companionship. There was purpose here, potential that neither of them had fully grasped when they first chose each other at the adoption fair. Maybe, Dorothy said carefully, Buddy wasn't just waiting for a family. Maybe he was waiting for the right kind of work to do. The idea planted itself in Emma's mind like a seed, growing stronger over the following days as she watched Buddy's interactions with the people they encountered during their walks. His patient attention to Mrs. Chun when her arthritis flared, his gentle response to the nervous energy of children waiting at the bus stop, his calm presence that seemed to steady everyone around him. Emma began to draw maps of their neighborhood walks, noting the houses where elderly people lived alone, the families with young children, the places where someone might benefit from Buddy's particular gift for providing comfort. She didn't yet know what to call this growing awareness, but she sensed that their story was evolving into something larger than she had originally imagined. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, Emma felt hope blooming in her chest, not the naive optimism of a child who believed everything would work out simply because she wanted it to, but the more mature understanding that sometimes challenges pointed toward opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Buddy had been rejected by family after family at the adoption fair because he was old, because he came with complications, because he didn't fit the image of what people thought they wanted. But lying in their small apartment above Mrs. Chun's garage, watching him sleep with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had found his calling, Emma began to understand that being overlooked might have been the best thing that ever happened to all of them. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while Emma was at school, and Dorothy was struggling to make their monthly budget stretch over an ever-growing pile of necessities. A crisp, professional voice identified herself as Sandra Williams from the County Department of Social Services. "I'm calling to schedule a home visit," Ms. Williams explained, her tone neutral but carrying undertones that made Dorothy's stomach clench. "We've received some concerns about the living situation of a minor child in your care." Dorothy's mind immediately raced through possibilities. The neighbor complaints about Buddy, their recent move to less stable housing, Emma's occasional absences from school when Dorothy's health required extra help around the house. Any one of these could trigger the kind of official attention that terrified anyone raising a child on limited resources. What kind of concerns? Dorothy asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Ms. Williams replied. "Would Thursday afternoon be convenient?" The 2 days between the phone call and the visit passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Dorothy cleaned their small apartment until it gleamed, organized Emma's school papers to demonstrate academic progress, and rehearsed explanations for every potential criticism a social worker might raise. Emma sensed the tension immediately when she arrived home from school on Tuesday to find her grandmother scrubbing baseboards that were already spotless. "Someone from the county is coming to visit us," Dorothy explained, not seeing any point in sugarcoating the situation. "They want to make sure you're being properly cared for." Emma's face went very still. She had been through the social services system before, in the chaotic months after her parents' death, when well-meaning adults made decisions about her future with clipboard efficiency and careful professional distance. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked quietly. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Dorothy replied, though her voice carried more determination than confidence. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and damp. the kind of weather that made their small apartment feel even smaller. Miss Williams appeared promptly at 2 o'clock, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the practiced assessment skills of someone who had seen every variation of family crisis imaginable. Buddy greeted their visitor with his usual gentle dignity, approaching for a polite sniff before returning to his spot by the window. Ms. Williams noted his presence with professional interest but made no immediate comment. The interview began with standard questions about Emma's health, education, and daily routine. Dorothy answered each query carefully, providing documentation when requested: report cards, medical records, evidence of the stable, loving environment she had worked to create despite their financial limitations. Emma seems to be thriving academically, Miss Williams observed, reviewing the school reports. Her teachers speak very highly of her maturity and empathy. That's often a sign of good care at home. Dorothy felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but remained cautious. Social workers were trained to look beyond surface presentations, to identify problems that families might try to hide. It was while they were discussing Emma's adjustment to their new living situation that Buddy did something extraordinary. Ms. Williams had been taking notes on a tablet, her professional demeanor unchanged, when she suddenly paused and pressed her hand to her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice slightly strained. "I have a heart condition. Sometimes the stress of these visits." She stopped, clearly trying to regain her composure without alarming her clients. Buddy's response was immediate and remarkable. Without any command or encouragement, he rose from his place by the window and approached Miss Williams with deliberate calm. He positioned himself beside her chair and gently rested his head on her knee, his warm brown eyes looking up at her with an expression of infinite understanding. The effect was instantaneous. Miss Williams's breathing steadied. Her hand moved automatically to stroke Buddy's soft ears, and her rigid professional posture relaxed into something more human. That's quite unusual," she said after a moment, though she continued petting Buddy. "He seems to understand that I was distressed." "He's very sensitive to people's emotions," Dorothy said carefully, recognizing that this moment might be more important than any documentation she could provide. "Emma says he has a gift for knowing when someone needs comfort." Ms. Williams continued the interview with Buddy maintaining his vigil beside her chair, occasionally shifting position, but never moving far from her side. Dorothy noticed that the social worker's questions became less clinical, more conversational, as if Buddy's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of their interaction. When Emma arrived home from school, she found Ms. Williams sitting on their small couch with Buddy stretched out beside her, his head resting on her lap while she absently scratched behind his ears. "This is your dog?" Ms. Williams asked, though the answer was obvious from the way Buddy's tail began wagging at Emma's appearance. "Yes, ma'am," Emma replied politely. "His name is Buddy. We adopted him from the pet fair in September. He's quite remarkable," Ms. Williams said. "I've never experienced anything quite like his response to stress. It's almost like he's been trained for therapeutic work." The conversation that followed would prove to be the turning point in their story. As Emma described Buddy's behavior with Tyler in the park, his gentle interactions with elderly neighbors, and his apparent ability to sense when people needed comfort, Ms. Williams listened with growing interest. "Has anyone ever mentioned therapy? Dog programs to you?" she asked finally. Both Dorothy and Emma shook their heads, though something in Emma's expression suggested the idea resonated with her. "There are formal programs that train dogs to provide emotional support in hospitals, nursing homes, schools, anywhere people might benefit from animal-assisted therapy," Ms. Williams explained. "Based on what I've observed today and what you've described, Buddy might be a natural candidate for that kind of work." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a printed article from a professional journal. "This is about a therapy dog program at Children's Hospital downtown. They're always looking for suitable dogs and handlers. The training is extensive, but dogs who complete the program become certified therapy animals. Emma accepted the article with hands that trembled, slightly with excitement. The photograph showed dogs of various breeds and ages working with patients, providing comfort to sick children, offering steady presence to anxious families, bringing moments of joy to sterile hospital environments. But wouldn't Buddy be too old for training? Dorothy asked, though she could see the spark of possibility igniting in Emma's eyes. Age isn't necessarily a barrier, Ms. Williams replied. In fact, older dogs often make excellent therapy animals because they're calmer, more focused, less likely to be distracted by excitement. The key qualities are temperament, training responsiveness, and the kind of natural empathy that Buddy demonstrated today. As Ms. Williams prepared to leave, she turned to Dorothy with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal warmth. I came here today because someone raised concerns about Emma's living situation. But what I've observed is a child who is clearly loved, well cared for, and developing remarkable maturity and empathy. The bond between Emma and this dog is obviously beneficial for both of them. She paused at the door, looking back at Buddy, who had returned to his spot by the window, but continued to watch her with attentive eyes. I'll be recommending that no further intervention is necessary, she said, and I hope you'll consider looking into that therapy dog program. I have a feeling Buddy might have been waiting his whole life for this kind of purpose. After Ms. Williams left, Emma sat on the floor beside Buddy, the therapy dog article spread out in front of them. The photograph seemed to glow with possibility images of dogs who had found their calling in service to others, handlers who had discovered that their pets possessed gifts beyond companionship. What do you think, boy? Emma whispered, running her fingers through Buddy's coat. Do you want to be a therapy dog? Buddy's tail thumped against the floor in what Emma chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, she felt hope blooming in her chest. Not just hope for keeping their family together, but hope for something larger, more meaningful than anything she had originally imagined. Dorothy watched from the kitchen, seeing her granddaughter transformed by possibility. The social worker's visit, which they had dreaded as a potential disaster, had instead revealed a path forward that none of them had seen before. Sometimes, Dorothy reflected, the most frightening moments turned out to be doorways to opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. That evening, as Emma read aloud from the therapy dog article while Buddy dozed beside her, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The sense that their struggles had been leading somewhere purposeful all along. Buddy hadn't been rejected by all those families at the adoption fair because he was inadequate. He had been waiting for the family who would recognize his true calling. And maybe, Dorothy thought as she watched Emma's animated discussion of certification requirements and training schedules, Emma had been waiting for the same thing, a purpose that would transform her from a child who had lost everything into someone who could help others heal from their own losses. The therapy dog. Training program began on a Saturday morning in November in a community center that smelled like floor wax and possibility. Emma arrived early, clutching the folder of paperwork that had taken 2 weeks to complete veterinary records, behavioral assessments, applications that required signatures from adults who believed in what they were attempting. The room filled, gradually with other hopeful teens, a retired teacher with a young German shepherd, a teenager with a border collie mix who had been rescued from a shelter, an elderly man whose standard poodle moved with the patient dignity of a dog who understood the importance of their mission. Emma felt suddenly young and uncertain among these experienced handlers, until Buddy settled beside her chair with his characteristic calm, and she remembered that age wasn't measured only in years. "Welcome to Pause for Healing," announced the instructor, a woman named Carol, whose confident smile suggested she had guided many nervous beginners through this process. Over the next 12 weeks, You and your dogs will learn the skills necessary to provide comfort and support to people in medical facilities, schools, and care centers. The training was more rigorous than Emma had anticipated. Each session built on the previous week's lessons, starting with basic obedience commands and progressing to complex scenarios that tested both dog and handler under challenging conditions. Buddy needed to remain calm around medical equipment, ignore distractions from other animals, respond immediately to Emma's signals, and demonstrate the kind of gentle temperament that could comfort anxious patients. Emma threw herself into the training with the focused intensity of someone who understood that this opportunity represented more than just certification. It was their chance to transform months of struggle into something meaningful. She practiced commands at home until Buddy could respond to her subtlest gestures, studied therapy dog protocols until she could recite proper procedures in her sleep, and read everything she could find about animal-assisted therapy. Dorothy watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. Emma's dedication to the training was remarkable, but it came with pressure that seemed heavy for an 8-year-old's shoulders. Some evenings, Dorothy found her granddaughter in tears of frustration when Buddy couldn't master a particular command, or when Emma's own nervousness interfered with their communication. "You're being too hard on yourself," Dorothy said one evening after a particularly challenging training session had left Emma discouraged. "Learning takes time for both of you." "But what if we're not good enough?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger each week. "What if we fail the certification test? What if all this work is for nothing?" Dorothy settled beside Emma on their small couch, Buddy immediately positioning himself where both women could pet him. "Tell me what you've learned about Buddy since we started this training." Emma considered the question seriously. "I've learned that he's braver than I thought, and more patient. And he really does seem to understand when people are hurting." "And what has he learned about you?" "That I won't give up on him," Emma replied without hesitation. "That I'll keep trying even when things are hard." "Then you've both already succeeded at the most important part," Dorothy said gently. "The rest is just paperwork." The training sessions became a highlight of Emma's weeks, providing structure and purpose that extended far beyond their small apartment. She began to make friends among the other handlers, particularly Mrs. Patterson, a different Mrs. Patterson from their former neighbor, whose elderly spaniel mix was also working towards certification. "You have a natural gift for this," Mrs. Patterson observed one afternoon as they practiced walking exercises in the community center parking lot. "The way you read Buddy's signals, the way he trusts your guidance, that kind of partnership takes some people years to develop." Emma felt a warmth at the compliment that had nothing to do with personal pride and everything to do with recognition of the bond she and Buddy had built through months of challenges and changes. They had learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs, to work as a team in ways that surprised even their instructor. The community began to take notice of their progress. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, invited her to give a presentation to the class about therapy dogs, and Emma found herself speaking with confidence about animal-assisted therapy, proper handling techniques, and the difference between service dogs and therapy dogs. Her classmates listened with genuine interest, and several asked if they could meet Buddy when he finished his certification at home. The financial pressures hadn't disappeared, but they felt more manageable within the context of working toward a goal. Dorothy had found a part-time job doing data entry for a local business, work she could complete during Emma's school hours. Mrs. Chun had become more than just a landlord. She often invited them for dinner, helped Emma with homework when Dorothy worked late, and had become Buddy's most devoted neighborhood fan. "That dog has brought good fortune to this house," Mrs. Chun declared one evening as they shared a meal of her famous dumplings. "I can feel the difference in the energy here." Emma wasn't sure about energy and fortune, but she couldn't deny that. Their lives felt more hopeful than they had in months. Even Buddy seemed to understand that he was working toward something important. His attention during training sessions became more focused, his responses to commands more reliable, his natural empathy more purposeful. The first real test of their progress came during a practice visit to a local nursing home. Emma had never been inside such a facility before, and the combination of medical equipment, unfamiliar sounds, and the vulnerability of elderly residents made her nervous in ways that the community center training hadn't prepared her for. But Buddy moved through the facility with remarkable composure, approaching each resident with gentle attention while remaining alert to Emma's guidance. When they encountered Mrs. Foster, an elderly woman whose family rarely visited, Buddy seemed to sense her loneliness and positioned himself where she could pet him while Emma sat beside her chair. "He's beautiful," Mrs. Foster said, her voice soft with emotion as she stroked Buddy's ears. "I had a dog like this when I was young. Golden retrievers have such wise eyes." Anna watched the interaction with growing understanding of what therapy work really meant. It wasn't about performing tricks or following complex commands. It was about presence, about offering comfort without judgment, about bringing moments of connection to people who might otherwise feel forgotten. "Does he like being petted behind his ears?" Mrs. Foster asked. "That's his favorite spot," Emma replied, guiding the woman's frail hands to the place where Buddy's tail wagged most enthusiastically. They spent 20 minutes with Mrs. Foster, listening to stories about her childhood. Dog and watching Buddy provide the kind of companionship that no medical intervention could offer. When it was time to leave, the elderly woman's eyes were brighter than when they had arrived. "Will you come back?" she asked. "When we finish our certification, we'll be here every week," Emma promised, understanding for the first time the full weight of responsibility that came with this kind of work. The drive home was quiet, both Emma and Dorothy processing what they had witnessed. Buddy slept in the back seat with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had worked hard at something important. "How do you feel about what happened today?" Dorothy asked as they pulled into Mrs. Chun's driveway. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching Buddy's peaceful sleep in the rearview mirror. "I feel like we found what we were supposed to do," she said finally. "Like everything that happened to us, losing our house, moving here, all the hard parts was leading us to this." That evening, as Emma filled out her training journal with detailed notes about their nursing home visit, she found herself writing not just about Buddy's performance, but about her own growing sense of purpose. The scared, withdrawn child who had chosen an overlooked dog at a pet adoption fair was becoming someone who could offer comfort to others facing their own struggles with loss and loneliness. The certification test was still weeks away, but Emma, no longer worried about passing or failing. She had discovered something more valuable than a certificate. She had found her calling, and it was helping others discover that being overlooked or different didn't mean being without value. Buddy stretched out beside her desk, his breathing deep and even as she worked on her notes. Tomorrow they would practice more commands, refine their techniques, prepare for scenarios they might encounter in their work. But tonight, Emma simply sat with the satisfaction of knowing that their story was becoming something larger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined when she first saw an old dog waiting patiently in his crate for someone to recognize his worth. The certification test arrived on a cold February morning when frost still clung to the windows of the community. Center and Emma's breath made small clouds in the parking lot. She had been awake since 5 o'clock, running through commands in her mind and trying to calm the nervous energy that made her hands shake as she clipped Buddy's leash to his collar. "Remember," Dorothy said as they walked toward the building, "you and Buddy have been preparing for this for months. You know what you're doing." Emma nodded, though her stomach continued to flutter with anticipation. The other testing teams were already assembled in the main room, their dogs sitting in perfect heel position, while their handlers reviewed notes and spoke in hushed, serious tones. The atmosphere felt different from their regular training sessions, more formal, more consequential. Judge Patricia Coleman commanded attention simply by entering the room. A certified therapy dog evaluator with 30 years of experience, she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every possible variation of human-animal partnership. Her clipboard held the official evaluation forms that would determine whether months of work resulted in certification or disappointment. Today's evaluation consists of 8 stations, Judge Coleman announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. Each team will rotate through scenarios designed to simulate real-world therapy work. Your dog will be tested on obedience, temperament, and response to medical equipment, sudden noises, and interactions with people of various ages and abilities. Emma felt Buddy shift slightly beside her, his warm body pressing against her leg in a gesture of mutual support. She looked down at his calm brown eyes and felt some of her nervousness ease. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it together. The first station tested basic obedience commands in a distracting environment. Volunteers moved around the testing area, carrying clipboards, wheeling medical equipment, and engaging in conversation designed to challenge the dog's focus. Emma guided Buddy through sit, stay, down, and heel commands while a volunteer pushed a wheelchair past them and another dropped a stack of metal trays with deliberate noise. Buddy's ears flickered at the sudden clatter, but his attention remained fixed on Emma. His responses to her commands were immediate and precise, the result of countless hours of practice in their small apartment and weekend sessions at the community center. Excellent focus, Judge Coleman noted on her evaluation form, though her expression remained neutral. The second station simulated a hospital environment, complete with 4 poles, oxygen tanks, and the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. Emma had worried about this scenario during their training. Buddy had never shown fear of medical equipment, but the concentration of unfamiliar sounds and smells might overwhelm any dog. Instead, Buddy moved through the mock hospital room with careful attention, sniffing politely at equipment when invited but never pulling toward it or showing anxiety. When a volunteer in scrubs approached with a stethoscope, Buddy stood calmly while the cold metal touched his chest, his tail wagging gently at the human interaction. Very good, the volunteer murmured, making notes on her own clipboard. The third station challenged Buddy's response to children, a crucial skill for therapy work in pediatric settings. 3 young volunteers, ranging in age from 5 to 12, were instructed to interact with Buddy in ways that might test his patience. Sudden movements, enthusiastic petting, and the kind of unpredictable behavior that characterized excited children. Emma watched carefully as the youngest volunteer, a girl named Sophie, approached Buddy with the kind of uncoordinated enthusiasm that might startle a less patient dog. Buddy lowered himself slightly, bringing his head closer to Sophie's level, and accepted her somewhat clumsy attempts at petting with gentle tolerance. When Sophie accidentally pulled too hard on his ear, Buddy simply shifted position rather than pulling away, keeping himself available for interaction while protecting his comfort. Emma felt a surge of pride at his mature response to childish enthusiasm. Does he like kids? Sophie asked, her small hands now moving more gently through Buddy's fur. He loves them, Emma replied, meaning every word. The fourth station tested Buddy's reaction to people using mobility equipment. A volunteer approached in a wheelchair, moving with deliberate speed to gauge whether the unusual sound and movement would cause anxiety or aggressive behavior. Buddy watched the approach with interest rather than concern, stepping aside to allow the wheelchair to pass before approaching the volunteer for gentle interaction. He's very calm, the volunteer observed, reaching down to pet Buddy's head. Some dogs get nervous around wheels, but he acts like he's seen this before. Emma realized that Buddy's experience with Dorothy's occasional use of a walking cane and their encounters with elderly neighbors who used various mobility aids had prepared him for this challenge in ways she hadn't fully appreciated. The most difficult station involved exposure to sudden, loud noises designed to test startle response and recovery time. Emma positioned Buddy in a sit-stay command while volunteers created unexpected sounds-dropping books, slamming doors, playing recordings of crying babies and emergency sirens. Each noise caused Buddy's ears to perk up and his body to tense slightly, but he remained in position and looked to Emma for guidance rather than bolting or becoming agitated. His trust in her leadership was absolute, even when faced with sounds that triggered natural canine alarm responses. Recovery time excellent, Judge Coleman noted. No signs of ongoing anxiety. The sixth station simulated interactions with elderly patients, including those who might be confused or agitated. A volunteer actor portrayed an elderly man with dementia, displaying the kind of unpredictable behavior that therapy teams often encountered in care facilities. The volunteer's sudden movements and raised voice created a challenging environment, but Buddy approached with the same gentle patience he had shown during their practice sessions at the nursing home. When the actor reached out with shaking hands, Buddy positioned himself within easy reach while remaining alert to Emma's signals. Good boy, the volunteer repeated, his agitation calming as he stroked Buddy's soft ears. The transformation was remarkable from anxiety to peace through simple contact with the patient. Understanding animal. The seventh station tested Buddy's behavior around food and treats in a medical setting. Volunteers scattered crackers and small toys around the testing area, then evaluated whether Buddy would break commands to investigate these distractions. Emma guided him through the obstacle course of temptations, watching with satisfaction as he ignored dropped food and interesting smells in favor of following her directions. Months of practice with impulse control were paying off in this crucial moment. The final station was the most important, a simulation of actual therapy work with a volunteer who portrayed a lonely, withdrawn patient. Emma was instructed to spend 10 minutes providing a therapy visit while Judge Coleman observed their natural interaction style. The volunteer, a teenage girl named Maria, sat in a chair with her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the floor, embodying the kind of defensive posture that therapy teams often encountered among patients dealing with trauma or depression. Emma approached slowly, introducing herself and Buddy in the gentle manner she had learned during training. Hi, I'm Emma, and this is Buddy. Would you like to meet him? Maria's response was minimal, a slight nod without eye contact. Emma settled into a nearby chair, allowing Buddy to position himself where Maria could see him without feeling pressured to interact. He's 8 years old, just like me, Emma said conversationally. He came from an adoption fair where nobody wanted him because he wasn't a puppy. But it turned out he was exactly the right dog for our family. Something in Emma's tone, or perhaps in the parallel between rejection and eventual acceptance, seemed to reach Maria. She glanced up for the first time, making brief eye contact with Buddy, who responded with a gentle tail wag. Can I pet him? Maria asked quietly. Of course, Emma replied. He loves being petted behind his ears. As Maria's defensive posture gradually relaxed under Buddy's patient presence, Emma felt the profound satisfaction of watching their months of training translate into real comfort for another person. This was why they had worked so hard, why they had pushed through financial struggles and neighborhood complaints and moments of doubt. When the 10 minutes ended, Maria was smiling, the first genuine expression Judge Coleman had seen from her all morning. Thank you, she said to Emma, then looked directly at Buddy. You're a very good dog. Judge Coleman called all the teams together for the final evaluation. Emma's heart pounded as she waited for the results that would determine whether their months of preparation had been successful. Certification requires passing scores in all 8 categories, the judge announced. Each team will receive individual feedback, but I want to commend all of you for the dedication and hard work evident in today's testing. Emma barely heard the individual scores as Judge Coleman worked through her evaluation form. All she could focus on was Buddy's steady presence beside her, and the growing realization that regardless of the official outcome, they had already achieved something remarkable together. Team Emma and Buddy, Judge Coleman called, and Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. Congratulations. You have passed certification and are now officially registered as a therapy dog team. The relief and joy that flooded through Emma was so intense that she had to sit down quickly to avoid falling. Buddy, sensing her emotional state, immediately moved closer and rested his head on her knee, the same comforting gesture that had started their journey toward this moment. The moment when Judge Coleman placed the official therapy dog vest over Buddy's shoulders felt like watching magic transform into reality. The bright blue vest with its official patches and identification card marked him as something more than a pet. He was now a certified therapy animal, trained and tested and ready to bring comfort to people who needed it most. Emma's hands trembled as she adjusted the vest's straps, making sure it fit properly across Buddy's chest and back. He stood with patient dignity during the process, seeming to understand the significance of this moment, even if he couldn't read the words. Therapy dog embroidered across the fabric. How does it feel? Dorothy asked, though the answer was written clearly across Emma's face, a combination of pride, relief, and overwhelming joy that made words seem inadequate. It feels like we did something important, Emma replied, kneeling beside Buddy to straighten his official identification badge. Like all the hard parts were worth it. The certification ceremony was small but meaningful, held in the same community center where they had spent countless Saturday mornings learning commands and practicing scenarios. The other successful teams gathered for photographs and brief speeches from program coordinators, who emphasized the responsibility that came with their new credentials. But the real celebration came 2 days later, when Emma and Buddy made their first official therapy visit to Children's Hospital downtown. Emma had visited hospitals before emergency room trips for childhood injuries. The day they brought Dorothy in for x-rays after a fall, but she had never entered one as someone whose presence was specifically requested, specifically valued. The pediatric wing buzzed with controlled activity, nurses moving efficiently between rooms while families clustered in waiting areas with the strained expressions of people managing hope and fear in equal measure. Emma felt momentarily overwhelmed by the environment, but Buddy moved beside her with the same calm confidence he had shown during certification testing. Their first patient was a 7-year-old girl named Ashley, who had been in the hospital for 3 weeks following complications from surgery. Her room was filled with get-well cards and stuffed animals, but Ashley herself sat propped up in bed with the listless expression of someone who had grown tired of being brave. "Ashley, this is Emma and her therapy dog Buddy," announced Sarah, the child life specialist who coordinated therapy visits. "They're here to visit with you for a while, if you'd like." Ashley's response was cautious interest rather than immediate enthusiasm. She had learned to be wary of new people and procedures, even those that claimed to be pleasant rather than medical. But when Buddy approached her bed with gentle patience, something in his calm presence seemed to reach through her defensive walls. "He's really soft," Ashley observed after several minutes of hesitant petting. "And he doesn't try to lick my face like other dogs." "Buddy's very polite," Emma explained. "He knows that some people don't like wet kisses, so he waits to be invited." The visit stretched into nearly an hour, with Ashley gradually becoming more animated as she told Buddy about her surgery, her boredom with hospital food, and her excitement about going home soon. Emma listened with the focused attention she had learned during training, asking questions that encouraged Ashley to talk, while Buddy provided steady, comforting presence. When it was time to leave, Ashley's demeanor had transformed from withdrawn to engaged. "Will you come back?" she asked, echoing Mrs. Foster's question from their practice visit to the nursing home. "We'll be here every Tuesday," Emma promised. Buddy likes making new friends. Their second visit that day was to the adolescent unit, where teenagers dealing with various medical challenges often struggled with the isolation and loss of control that came with extended hospital stays. Emma had worried about connecting with patients closer to her own age, but her concerns proved unfounded. Marcus, a 13-year-old recovering from a serious skateboarding accident, initially claimed he wasn't interested in some kid's pet therapy thing. But Emma noticed how his expression softened when Buddy positioned himself where Marcus could reach him from his wheelchair. "He doesn't care that I can't walk right now," Marcus observed after spending several minutes absently stroking Buddy's ears while discussing his frustration with physical therapy. "Buddy's had some joint problems too," Emma said. "He takes medicine for arthritis, and some days he moves more slowly than others. But he doesn't let that stop him from doing what he loves." The parallel between their situations wasn't lost on Marcus, who began asking questions about Buddy's condition and treatment. By the end of their visit, he was making plans to research therapy dog careers, inspired by the idea that physical limitations didn't have to define life possibilities. The drive home from their first official therapy visits was quiet. All three family members processing the significance of what they had just experienced. Buddy slept in the back seat with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had worked hard at meaningful labor. "How do you feel about today?" Dorothy asked as they pulled into Mrs. Chun's driveway. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching Buddy's peaceful sleep in the rearview mirror. "I feel like we found what we were meant to do," she said finally. "Like everything that happened to us, the adoption fair, losing our house, all the training was leading us here." That evening, Mrs. Chun insisted on celebrating with a special dinner featuring all of Emma's favorite dishes. She had followed their therapy dog journey with the invested interest of someone who understood that their success reflected well on the entire household. "You should be very proud," Mrs. Chun said as they shared spring rolls and fried rice around her kitchen table. "Not many children your age could handle such responsibility." "It doesn't feel like responsibility," Emma replied, surprising herself with the honesty of her response. "It feels like getting to do something I love with my best friend." Word of their certification spread through their small community with the speed of genuinely good news. Emma's teacher arranged for her to give another presentation to her class, this time wearing Buddy's official vest and demonstrating some of the commands they had learned during training. Her classmates listened with genuine amazement as Emma explained the difference between service dogs and therapy dogs, described the certification process, and answered questions about what it felt like to help sick children feel better. "Isn't it sad to see people who are hurt?" asked Madison Wells, her previous skepticism replaced by curiosity. "Sometimes," Emma admitted. "But it's also happy, because we can help them feel less scared or lonely." And Buddy is really good at making people smile. The neighborhood children who had once teased Emma about her old, ugly dog now asked respectful questions about Buddy's work and requested demonstrations of his training. Emma found herself in the unexpected position of being locally famous for something positive, something that made other people proud to know her. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian, who had delivered the sobering news about Buddy's arthritis months earlier, called to congratulate them on their certification. "I have to admit, when you first brought Buddy in, I was concerned about the financial challenges of caring for an older dog," he said during a follow-up appointment. "But seeing what you've accomplished together, this is exactly the kind of story that reminds me why I became a veterinarian." He had reduced their fees for Buddy's ongoing care, recognizing that their therapy work represented a community service that deserved support. "Certified therapy dogs get a professional discount," he explained with a smile that suggested this policy had been created specifically for their situation. That night, As Emma filled out her therapy visit log with detailed notes about Ashley and Marcus and the other patients they had met, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a withdrawn, grieving child whose biggest hope was simply keeping her beloved dog. Now she was a certified therapy dog handler, making a real difference in other people's lives while pursuing work that felt more like calling than obligation. Buddy stretched out beside her desk, still wearing his therapy vest because Emma hadn't wanted to take it off yet. Tomorrow they would return to the hospital for more visits, more opportunities to bring comfort to people facing their own struggles with illness and uncertainty. But tonight, Emma simply sat with the deep satisfaction of knowing that their story had become something larger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined when she first saw an old dog waiting patiently in his crate for someone to recognize his worth. Sometimes, the most beautiful transformations happen not in spite of being overlooked, but because of it, because being different forced you to find creative paths toward purposes that conventional approaches could never have revealed. 6 months after receiving his therapy dog certification, Buddy had become a minor celebrity at Children's Hospital. Nurses would smile and wave when they saw his distinctive blue vest coming down the hallway, and young patients would ask their parents when the golden dog and his girl would be visiting again. Emma had grown into her role as a therapy dog handler with the natural confidence of someone who had found her true calling. At 9 years old, she could navigate hospital protocols with professional ease, adapt her approach to match each patient's needs, and recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a visit should end or continue. Their Tuesday afternoon rounds had expanded to include the pediatric ICU, where Buddy's calming presence proved especially valuable for families enduring the stress of critical illness. His ability to remain steady and peaceful in high-emotion environments made him particularly suited for the most challenging situations. "He's like a furry therapist," observed Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician who had initially been skeptical about animal therapy in intensive care settings. "I've watched him sense when parents are about to break down and position himself exactly where they need comfort most." Dorothy's health had stabilized with the reduction in financial stress and the increased sense of purpose that came from supporting Emma's meaningful work. Mrs. Chun had become more than a landlord. She was family now, often joining them for dinner and proudly sharing updates about her therapy dog with anyone who would listen. The photo album that sat on their small kitchen table had grown thick with pictures documenting their journey. Emma and Buddy at certification ceremony, hospital visits with young patients, community events where they demonstrated therapy dog work, and quiet moments at home that captured the deepening bond between a girl and her dog. But the most significant return came on a warm spring afternoon when Emma suggested they visit the adoption fair that was being held at the same fairgrounds where their story had begun 8 months earlier. "I want to see if there are other dogs like Buddy," Emma explained as they walked through the familiar rows of cages and enclosures, dogs that other people might overlook. The scene was remarkably similar to their first visit, families gravitating toward the youngest, most energetic animals, while older pets waited with patient dignity for someone to notice their quieter qualities. Emma moved through the displays with the observant eye of someone who had learned to recognize potential beneath surface appearances. She found what she was looking for in a corner section labeled Senior Pets, a 9-year-old Labrador mix named Charlie, whose gray muzzle and gentle eyes reminded her immediately of Buddy's patient expression during his own adoption day. "He's been here for 4 months, a volunteer explained when Emma stopped to read Charlie's information card. "Sweet disposition, good with children, but most people want younger dogs." Emma knelt by Charlie's enclosure, extending her hand for a polite sniff. His response was immediate and familiar, the gentle approach of a dog who had learned not to hope too hard, but couldn't help being optimistic about human contact. "What do you think, Buddy?" Emma asked her certified therapy dog, who stood beside her in his official vest. "Do you think Charlie might have special talents too?" Buddy's tail wagged in what Emma chose to interpret as agreement, though she suspected he was simply enjoying the social atmosphere of the adoption fair. They spent an hour talking with potential adopters, sharing Buddy's story and encouraging families to consider older pets who might not display the obvious appeal of puppies, but possessed the kind of settled wisdom that made excellent companions. "We almost didn't choose Buddy because he was older," Emma told a couple who were debating between a senior cat and a kitten. "But it turned out that his age was exactly what made him perfect for therapy work." Sometimes the things that make animals seem less adoptable are actually their biggest strengths. Her words carried the authority of lived experience, and Emma noticed several families gravitating toward the senior pet section after hearing Buddy's transformation story. By the end of the afternoon, 3 older animals had found new homes, including Charlie, who went home with a retired teacher who specifically wanted a calm, mature companion. The drive home felt ceremonial, marking not just the end of their adoption fair visit, but a full-circle completion of the journey that had begun in that same parking lot months earlier. Emma reflected on how much had changed since that first day when she had chosen and overlooked dog out of instinct and hope. "Do you remember what I was like when we first got Buddy?" she asked Dorothy as they pulled into Mrs. Chun's familiar driveway. "You were quieter," Dorothy replied diplomatically, more careful about getting close to people. "I was scared," Emma said, with the matter-of-fact honesty that had replaced her childhood reticence. "Scared that if I loved something, it might be taken away. But Buddy taught me that not loving things because you might lose them is like not living because you might die." That evening, as Emma updated their therapy visit log with notes about their hospital rounds earlier that week, she found herself writing not just about individual patients, but about the larger patterns she had begun to notice in her work. Children, who initially rejected comfort, often needed it most. Elderly patients who claimed not to like dogs usually ended up forming the strongest connections with Buddy. Families dealing with medical crises discovered reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed when given permission to focus on simple, positive interactions. "I think we help people remember how to hope," Emma wrote in her journal. "Not hope that everything will be perfect, but hope that good things can still happen even when life is hard." Buddy had claimed his favorite spot by the window, though. Now he wore his therapy vest more often than not. It had become part of his identity, a symbol of the purpose that had transformed him from a shelter reject into a valued member of the medical team at one of the city's most respected hospitals. Their work had expanded beyond hospital visits to include school programs where Emma and Buddy taught other children about responsible pet ownership, empathy, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances. Emma had discovered she enjoyed public speaking, especially when it involved advocating for animals who might otherwise be overlooked. The best pets aren't always the prettiest or the youngest or the most energetic, she would tell elementary school assemblies. Sometimes the best pets are the ones who need you as much as you need them. Mrs. Chun had taken to introducing Emma as our neighborhood therapy dog handler with unmistakable pride, and their small apartment above the garage had become a gathering place for other families in the therapy dog program. Emma had found a community of people who understood that some purposes were worth pursuing regardless of the practical challenges they presented. As spring turned toward summer, Emma began making plans for their first anniversary as a certified therapy team. She wanted to organize a special event at the hospital, bringing together patients they had worked with over the months to celebrate the connections they had built. But sitting in their small apartment on this quiet evening, watching Buddy sleep, with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had spent the day doing meaningful work, Emma realized that the most important celebration was happening right now, in the simple recognition that their lives had become exactly what they were meant to be. A year ago, She had been a grieving child who chose an aging dog out of loneliness and instinct. Now she was a confident young woman who had found her calling in helping others heal, supported by a canine partner whose own transformation from reject to essential team member proved that society's initial judgments were often spectacularly wrong. Their story had become larger than just their own lives. It was proof that the most beautiful connections often happened between souls that the world had forgotten, and that being overlooked could be the first step toward discovering purposes that conventional paths could never reveal. Tomorrow they would return to the hospital, bringing comfort to new patients and continuing the work that had transformed them all. But tonight, Emma simply sat with the deep satisfaction of knowing that love, patience, and the willingness to see potential where others saw problems could change not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what truly mattered.